These are innovative and resourceful, and so are we. They never stop thinking about new ways to harm our country and our people, and neither do we. I think they misestimated the will and determination of the commander-in-chief, too. My party wrote off the African-American vote, and many African-Americans wrote off the Republican Party. I heard somebody say, where's Mandela? Well, Mandela's dead because Saddam Hussein killed all the Mandelas.
The name of George W. Bush. Among self-identified Democrats, those very favorable and somewhat favorable numbers add up to 51%. He was not president in 1903. It was not that long ago. Majority approval amongst Democrats.
That right now, today, when he left office, when George Bush left office, 6% of Democrats said that he was, at least not the worst president ever. Now 51% have a favorable or very favorable view of George Bush. 51% of Democrats. And I want to say, you're forgetting what this guy did.
At least some of them, it turns out that you can start an illegal war based on lies, kill 1 million people as a result of that war, try to rob Social Security and turn the money over to your Wall Street friends, and not to mention assume the office of president under false pretenses after you've lost fair and square. You can do all these things but still earn the affection of a majority of Democrats in this country just by saying mean things about somebody they and you both happen to dislike. I am, of course, speaking about former President George W. Bush, who at his heyday had popularity ratings of, I believe, about 28% or so, and yet is now much more popular with Democrats than he was a while back with the entire population of the United States of America. A recent poll showed that 51% of adults who identify as Democrats have a favorable opinion of the ex-president war criminal, compared with 42% who viewed him unfavorably.
Huge, the economic impact of his tax cuts, his attempt to privatize some of the massive social programs, the botched response to Katrina, the Iraq War perhaps, the killing of civilians abroad, torture and all of that. I mean, the number of different things that should disqualify him from ever being seen favorably by an American could go on and on and on. We could do multiple programs just on that.
George W. Bush, who was a disastrous president, crushed the economy, started the Iraq War on completely false pretenses, was a total neoliberal war hawk. Even he, who I disagree with so vehemently, would never have stooped to this level. So I always try to couch it to make sure that I'm not saying Bush wasn't that bad. I'm saying it's amazing that even someone as bad as Bush wouldn't have thought of doing this thing that Trump did.
George W. Bush left office. He only had a 22% approval rating. That's the lowest in the history of the US presidency during the time when we were doing approval rating polls.
So let me explain. When George W. Bush left office, you remember what his approval rating was?
Oh yeah,
26%.
Yeah.
Right now, even in this poll, Donald Trump's at 37%. In another poll, I saw Trump at 44%. So Bush was far more unpopular than Trump is today. So we have forgotten that the country universally despised George W. Bush by the time he left office.
Yeah.
George Bush has caught Richard Milhouse Nixon. He's caught him. 24%, the lowest approval rating ever. Congratulations. And also, the approval rating Richard Nixon had the day he resigned. The day he resigned.
War was a debacle of literally historic proportions. Hundreds of thousands of civilians lost their lives. It led to the creation of ISIS. It created chaos in the Middle East, let alone all the guys we lost, over 5,000 and then 50,000 injured, let alone the trillions of dollars we lost. And then there was the economic crash. When he left office, Democrats had him polling at among Democrats, 7%. And it has jumped from 7% to, as John pointed out, 51% now. So yes, you forget sometimes, right? And he comes out and does a nice speech, which I gave him credit for, against Donald Trump, and warning about, the creeping nationalism and warning about white supremacy. Okay, great, wonderful, I'll take it. But it doesn't, it's just real quick, John, but it doesn't wipe away the hundreds of thousands of dead civilians and the 8 million jobs we lost in that economic crash. It doesn't take those away at all.
That's right. We went to Iraq based on false premises, whether he lied about it or not. There were no weapons of mass destruction. That war was just wrong. And what happened in that war? 4,427 United States troops killed, but that wasn't an all-time low. There were 66,000 civilians killed, at least Iraqi civilians, but that wasn't an all-time low. There was 1,836 people killed in Hurricane Katrina, but that wasn't an all-time low. And by the way, there was 8 million jobs lost because of the recession he created, the Great Recession, but that wasn't an all-time low. And by the way, also, there was a little thing called 9/11 on Bush's watch, and that wasn't an all-time low. But Kanye dissed you, and that was your all-time low? Well, oh no, Kanye doesn't like you. Did your feelings get hurt, George?
Bush started a war against Iraq, a country that did not attack us. Bush lied and implied that Iraq was behind 9/11, to the point that about a little more than half of all Republicans actually, at the time of the invasion of Iraq, believed that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. He then, when it was proven that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Iraq, although that story still stuck for the poor, pathetic viewers of Fox so-called news and listeners of right-wing hate radio, who still believe it in many cases, Bush then went to lie number 2, which is, oh, well, maybe they didn't attack us. Maybe Saddam Hussein and Iraq didn't attack us on 9/11, but they're planning to because they've got weapons of mass destruction. This in the face of Scott Ritter and Hans Blix, the 2 UN weapons inspectors spending 3 or 4 years crisscrossing Iraq, looking in every nook and cranny, even under the bed in Saddam's palace, and they found nothing. There was nothing. There was evidence of a weapons of mass destruction program back in the late 80s when as I recall, when Iraq and Iran were having a hot war, and we were supporting both sides, by the way. We were supplying chemical weapons of mass destruction to Iraq to use against Iranians, and we were providing Iran with satellite maps showing where the Iraqi troops were. And so about 1 million soldiers on both sides were killed, and we thought that was, like some kind of good policy, right?
Here is now a total and utter pass to George W. Bush, who should be in a prison cell somewhere until he dies. I mean, this is a guy who waged an offensive war against a country that didn't attack us. We learned, hey, Saddam didn't do 9/11. And we didn't, first of all, second you learned that, oh, that was the justification for the war, now we got to go home. He didn't do 9/11, so we got to go home. What are you talking about? The whole purpose for the war just crumbled. But what did they do? They moved the goalpost. Oh, no, it's okay, now the standard is he has weapons of mass destruction. Okay, wait, what? So are you afraid he's going to use them against us? Not necessarily, he just has them. Okay, but he's still not a direct threat against us right now? Not necessarily, but he's got weapons of mass destruction. Okay, that's not a reason to go in there and start an offensive war against a country. But nonetheless, they're still in there, and they were doing their thing. And then when we found out that was bullshit, they moved the goalposts again. They just keep moving the goalposts. Finally, the final argument was he's just a bad guy. And then if you dared to say, hey, maybe we shouldn't do the war, they straw man you and say, I guess you like Saddam and you're in favor of everything he's ever done. Wait, what? No, I'm just saying, just because he's a bad guy, that's not the standard to go in there and topple a government, a sovereign government. That's like, I mean, George Bush was a bad guy. Do other countries have a right to do regime change against us? Trump's a bad guy. Do other countries, should Iran do regime change against us? And say, that's the same standard you guys used. He's a rogue actor. He just killed 30 civilians in Yemen, including an 8-year-old girl. That's a rogue state. It's a terror state. We got to get rid of him. No, man, no. So stop with the rehabilitation. There's no such thing as woke George Bush. Okay, what's the next move? Now they're going to allow on Dick Cheney and have Dick Cheney lecture us and lecture the Trump administration about what is moral. I don't want to hear anything from Dick Cheney about what's moral. I don't want to hear anything from George W. Bush, who had a compliant media in the lead up to the Iraq War. I don't want to hear Dick about, oh yeah, we need a free press, because the free press towed the line for you completely when we needed them most. When it was your massive deregulatory agenda, they weren't there to fight back against you. When it was your tax cuts for the rich, they weren't there to fight back against you. When it was for your unnecessary war in Iraq, they weren't there to fight back against you. So it's easy to say that. I'm
bit of praise. George W. Bush was a dangerous, unhinged president. He is responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of American troops overseas. He is responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians. He is a war criminal who authorized the use of illegal forms of torture, both overseas and at Guantanamo Bay. There is nothing that this man says or does that deserves any praise. He should be sitting in a prison right now, along with the other members of his administration who authorized torture and who lied us into a war that cost us thousands upon thousands upon thousands of American lives. He weakened the United States all over the world, the image that they hold of the United States. He squandered all of the goodwill that we received after the September 11th, 2001 terrorist attacks. He did that by launching a war against somebody who didn't even attack us. A war of revenge for his father and a war for oil. Furthermore, for somebody who doesn't like the racism, he is the one who helped to put the anti-Muslim mentality into millions of Americans. Most of us didn't really care one way or another before George W. Bush came along. But then he got up on his podium, he made speeches, he went around the country telling us how evil Islam is, that they're a bunch of terrorists and they hate us because of our freedom. It's a war on Christianity, we were told. And they were the enemies because they looked different and they worshiped in a different way.
In the midst of all this war, that the Bush family actually makes money on war. Remember the Carlyle Group, giant investment company that invested in the military-industrial complex? Well, just by coincidence, the head of the Carlyle Group for a while was George Bush Sr., George Bush Jr., an investor. And then you've got Bush's deregulations to the financial market, which arguably led right straight to the collapse of 2008. Bush called himself a born-again Christian, so he said, a quote from George W. Bush, "God told me to end the tyranny in Iraq." We got faith-based everything, right? Shoveling money to Jerry Falwell and company. Fighting same-sex marriage. George W. Bush wanted a constitutional ban. He wanted it written into the U.S. Constitution that gay people are second-class citizens and are not entitled to marry, gays and lesbians. Just said no. He cranked the war on drugs massively. He took $1.2 billion and poured it into the war on drugs to imprison more people of color. And he famously said gun control has nothing to do with crime control.
Trump administration, but you need to understand, buddy, that you started this, or you at least put it on steroids. You're responsible. You dumbed down the office of the president so much that 8 years after you left, we put a reality TV star in there. That's on you. Donald Trump is on you. Sarah Palin is on you. Michelle Bachmann, Louis Gohmert, Ted Cruz. You paved the way for these idiots. And I am sick and tired of people giving praise to this madman because he's intelligent enough to say that he doesn't necessarily like Donald Trump. It's the same.
I mean, this was the most conspicuous presidential failure in American history, perhaps, certainly in modern history, the disastrous wars in the Middle East, and of course, the complete collapse of the economy after a couple decades of deregulation. Who wouldn't want to distance themselves from that?
Jeb Bush got wrong, because getting wrong is what the Bushes do best. Okay, here's what Jeb Bush got wrong about that. Number one, and perhaps most importantly, we withdrew from Iraq because the Iraqi government insisted upon it. we did not get an okay to stay. Look, I had this complaint about Democrats when they were all saying that Obama got us out of Iraq. Iraq wanted us out. They required us to leave. And so we left. Otherwise,
trying to complete. He's a guy who says, you know why Jeb Bush thinks that we have ISIS? Because the president hasn't been tough enough. We have ISIS because his brother invaded Iraq and because they so incompetently managed the occupation. So this is how off base this guy is, and he's got advisors who are just as screwy about it as he is. How do you think this is going to end up? It's going to end up as bad or worse as what we got with his brother.
It's his heart. He had this tweet. My most bitter disappointment is the declining cultural cachet of Republican administrations. Now, I'm not even sure what that means. The cultural cachet. Like there was something really, I guess, like important about the last Republican administration.
They had like suits and they looked super severe and there was a lot of cachet.
Lest we forget,
they're not cool anymore?
Lest we forget, this was in our lifetime, semicolon. And it's a picture of Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, George W. Bush, Condoleezza Rice, George Tenet, Donald Rumsfeld, and Andy Card. All of whom could probably in some measure or another be tried on war crimes, ranging from their involvement and their unshackling of the regulations that were to prevent the torture that took place under their administration, the spying, the illegal spying on Americans that took place under their administration, the lying to the American public, the war of choice, which violated all sorts of international laws.
But in any case, back to George Bush. He violated Article 2 of the UN Charter, which says that no country can invade another country without permission of the United Nations or if they haven't been attacked, or unless they've been attacked. In other words, Article 2, Paragraph 4 prohibits preemptive strikes. Bush did a preemptive strike against Iraq.
Administration, they were convinced that George Bush, the first, didn't go far enough, did not take Saddam Hussein out of power. They had been part of the Project for a New American Century, which felt that Saddam Hussein was the key and Iraq was the key to regional hegemony in the Middle East, to control the oil fields, not to bring us cheap oil, but to control the spigot. In other words, when the Chinese come a-calling, You'll recall in the lead up to 9/11, there was a commission. There was a commission headed by Gary Hart, and I think it was Rudman.
Rudman, you're right.
Who were trying to dig into what were the biggest threats facing America. Gary Hart told us on the Old Majority Report that he sat around that table. There were about 25 participants. At the first meeting, they went around the table. What is the biggest threat facing America? Almost every single participant said terrorism. One person said China. People laughed at her. Maybe not laughed, but they didn't take her seriously. The second meeting, they were asked again. One person said China. That person was more or less disregarded. That person never showed up again at the panel. Her name was Lynn Cheney. Controlling the spigot, not just Iraqi oil, but Saudi oil, having a base of operations, which we now still do have, the biggest embassy in the world. Having a base of operations in Iraq was the linchpin of the new American century.
Fast forward to the days and weeks after 9/11. On October 14th, 2001, a senior Taliban leader, Deputy Prime Minister Haji Abdul Kabir, sent an official offer to Washington, saying that the Taliban would be willing to hand over Osama bin Laden to a third-party country if the U.S. stopped bombing Afghanistan. Kabir said, if America were to step back from the current policy, then we could negotiate. Then we could discuss which third country. But Bush, the same man who just months earlier had handed over a small fortune to the Taliban government to get them to stop the opium, rejected this latest offer of cooperation. Instead, he took up a scorched earth policy and bombed Afghanistan back to the Stone Age. Bush's decision to invade Afghanistan has cost our country over $713 billion just since 2001. And that number is rising by the millisecond, as you can see at the bottom of your screen. In fact, every hour, the war in Afghanistan is costing we the people, us, you and me, another $10.17 million. The Taliban offered to hand over bin Laden on a silver platter, but we said no. And now it's cost us hundreds of billions of dollars.
Another category of crimes by violating the United States Constitution. The day after that, now we're now up to September 21, John Yoo, a lawyer for the Justice Department, basically decided that the Fourth Amendment was moot. He wrote, quote, "The government may be justified in taking measures which in less troubled conditions could be seen as infringements of individual liberties." Now, those individual liberties had survived a civil war and 2 world wars, as well as a Cold War, but somehow they managed to describe the conditions after 9/11 as so exceptional that our Constitution no longer had any value.
It wasn't until we got hit, the incompetence of Bush and Cheney brought us to a whole new level of security in this country. Now we're listening to people's phone calls. Now we have a big fight over the Fourth Amendment. Now we have a very intrusive Patriot Act that we've had to debate over and over again. Now we've spent millions upon millions and trillions of dollars billions of dollars when it comes to security. Now we're feeling people up in airports. And oh, by the way,
a few of those things. First and foremost, George W. Bush stole the 2000 election with help from Jeb Bush. Jeb purged 50,000 voters from the Florida voting rolls, which would have been more than enough votes to secure the election for Al Gore and avoid the entire recall fiasco. He pulled America out of the Kyoto Protocol, which would have set high standards for carbon emission reductions. He withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. He ignored warnings about Osama bin Laden. He turned the world against us after the global support we had following 9/11 by invading Iraq instead of hunting for al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. He ignored the United Nations. He made Colin Powell present false evidence to the UN to support an Iraq invasion. He sent troops to war with unfit and insufficient gear. He enabled war profiteers like Halliburton, created several federal budget crises. He cut Pell Grants for low-income college students. He packed the courts with right-wing ideologues, and of course, he let the city of New Orleans drown after Hurricane Katrina.
Election of Barack Obama was supposed to be a repudiation of the George Bush years. And instead, we got 8 years of similar foreign policy. Now, Obama has not been weak on foreign policy like the Republicans want to say, and he certainly has not been as bad as George W. Bush. But things aren't necessarily better. We're still having American troops die in the Middle East for no reason. We're fighting other people's wars for them for no reason. We've taken out the people behind 9/11. And there is terrorism happening in Europe that is a direct result of the U.S.'s policies towards the Middle East during the Bush years and during the Obama years. The rise of ISIS is directly related to the U.S. occupation of Iraq. I mean, this is what the experts are saying. This is what military analysts are saying. And they predicted this when the United States went into Iraq 14 years ago. So President Obama's refusal to go after the Bush administration has just perpetuated this long chain of anti-United States sentiment in the Middle East. And that's only going to serve to make the problem worse.
That this man, George W. Bush, is by definition a war criminal, as was his entire administration, and yet none of them were ever held accountable for it. George W. Bush authorized torture of detainees. They rounded up people, even ones they knew were not involved in any kind of terrorist activities ever. They just cast such a wide net scooped up as many people as possible, threw them in CIA black sites or at Abu Ghraib or down in Gitmo so they could torture them, so they could demean them and hold them for years without any kind of due process whatsoever. And this is the man that the National Constitution Center decided to give the Liberty Medal to.
George created what he called the doctrine of preemption, writing that Bush can act against anyone, a group, an individual, quote, even if it was, or I should say, even if it would be, quote, difficult to establish that they have been or may be implicated in attacks. In other words, even if you don't have anything to do with terrorism, we can go after you without respecting the Constitution or the rule of law. To make sure that they got the answer they wanted, Donald Rumsfeld, another war criminal, set up his own intelligence unit to look for Iraqi links to terrorism that didn't exist. That was in October of 2001. Then began the illegal renderings, kidnappings of people and rendering them to other countries, and our Constitution was on the downswing. Look,
that isn't even the most startling part of the book. In the book, he also admits to a war crime. He said when they asked him, hey, should we waterboard Khalid Sheikh Mohammed? He admits it. In the book, he says, I told them, damn right. Go ahead and torture him, basically. Now, the quote right there is damn right, and it refers to waterboarding, okay? Now, is waterboarding really a war crime? Well, it's against the Geneva Conventions, which is international law, which we sign, and when we sign it, it becomes supreme law of the land here in the United States of America. But that's not just theoretical. We've prosecuted people for waterboarding before. I'm going to get to that in a second. But let's see what the generals think. One of our top generals is going to talk to Carl Levin here while Bush was still president, mind you. Here's his testimony.
General, do you believe that waterboarding is consistent with Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions?
No, sir, I don't.
You believe it's humane?
No, sir, I think it would go beyond that bound.
Well, he's not alone in thinking that, because here are the prosecutions we've done for waterboarding in this country. After the Spanish-American War, U.S. soldiers were court-martialed. After World War II, Japanese soldiers were convicted for waterboarding, a violation of our laws. And in 1983, a Texas sheriff was sentenced to 10 years in prison for waterboarding. Now, it seems to me we've got a confession here of a war crime and a clear violation of international and United States law. President George W. Bush should go to jail for at least 10 years. Will that happen? Not with an administration that only wants to look forward and never backward to crimes that were actually committed.
It's Article 8 of the International Criminal Court statutes and the Geneva Conventions, which are called war crimes. This is what we hung Nazis for after World War II, for torturing people. Bush actually, he didn't just torture people, like in Turkey and in black sites in Iraq and other countries. He didn't just torture people there. He brought them here. He built a torture factory in Guantanamo. Now, Trump says he wants to keep it open. So, this might be a tie. I don't know. But Bush built this torture factory in Guantanamo after torturing people in Iraq. When the pictures got out, it destroyed our reputation around the world. And Republicans continue, in many cases, to defend him on this, which is bizarre. Even David Petraeus, the general who was running our operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, admitted that the U.S. committed war crimes and violated international law. He admitted it. Torture. And then Bush said, oh, no, we never tortured anybody. He lied. He lied to you and me, George W. Bush. Lawrence Wilkerson, who was, Colin Powell's number 2. He was the chief of staff to Colin Powell. Came right out and said most of the detainees in Guantanamo Bay, were innocent. That didn't matter to George W. Bush. He wanted, he just wanted to destroy some lives to jack up his popularity with the Republicans. ISIS, as the group that calls itself the Islamic State, they emerged explicitly around 2004, 2005, largely in Iraq, after the George W. Bush administration went in And keep in mind, there was not one single al-Qaeda person in Iraq when we invaded Iraq. But because Paul Bremer and Donald Rumsfeld principally, and Cheney and Bush apparently, but apparently this was Bremer and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, this group of libertarians, and they believed that if you got government out of the way, you would have a wonderful society. And more than half of the GDP of Iraq was government-owned industries. You had government-owned, tire factories, government-owned steel factories, government-owned cement factories, government-owned businesses. And you had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party in order to get a job, which was the non-secular, non-religious socialist party that Saddam Hussein ran. And so just a couple of weeks into the war, after the war was successful, after we took down, because the war only lasted a couple of weeks, and then the occupation began. And when the occupation began, Bush sent L. Paul Bremer over to Iraq, and they shut down all of these government-owned businesses, fired everybody. They shut down the Iraqi army, which was 500,000 men, and it was the largest employer in Iraq. And you had to be, again, a Ba'athist Party member to be in the army. They shut that down, and they did something called de-Ba'athification. In other words, they said, if you're a Ba'ath Party member, which was all Sunnis, and which ran from the intelligentsia and the professional military, people working in hospitals, all the way down to the street sweepers. If you're a Ba'ath Party member or ever have been, you may not be employed again. And so, and we're shutting down these government industries, or you may not come back into the Iraqi army. And so the consequence of this was you had millions of men, young men, who were suddenly unemployed, who had weapons abound, and were seriously PO'd. And they cut all the government programs. Saddam Hussein had a program that was similar to our Social Security that took care of people in old age. It was a fairly generous program. We did away with that. Saddam had a program that was the equivalent of food stamps, the subsidized food for people of low income. We did away with that. Saddam had a program of national health care. We did away with that. Saddam had a program of free public education, including college. We did away with that. And the theory was, when we did away with all of this stuff, that now Iraq is a clean slate and the libertarian experiment can proceed, and government and corporations and billionaires from all over the world are going to flood into Iraq, or indigenous Iraqis will emerge who will create a flourishing new economy, and we will prove that libertarian ideology is right. And instead what happened was chaos. And out of that chaos came al-Qaeda. And then out of the al-Qaeda group, al-Qaeda came in, but a lot of these Sunnis just said, okay, screw that. I'm with al-Qaeda now because I'm no longer with Saddam Hussein, or I just no longer have a job. And then al-Qaeda, you had these internal divisions in al-Qaeda, and one of them was Anbar al-Awlaki, as I recall. And he started what became ISIL, the Islamic State in the Levant, or the Islamic State originally it was called the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, in 2005, with the explicit name. In 2006, they started becoming a real force. And by 2008, they had a presence in 4 countries. So, and this was all before Obama came along. So, Trump and the Republicans are engaging in some radical revisionist history. There would be no ISIL unless if George W. Bush had not lied us into the war in Iraq. It's just that simple. George W. Bush created ISIS.
President Bush got a daily briefing in August entitled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the U.S." and did nothing about it.
Bush did not keep us safe. We got hit on his watch. We got hit on Cheney's watch. Who was the president on September 11th, 2001? What was the presidential daily briefing of August 6, 2001, when counterintelligence agencies had briefed the president telling him that terrorists were going to hijack commercial planes and they wanted to fly them into buildings? What did Bush do? He went back to Crawford, Texas, where he got that briefing, and continued to chop wood.
We're all familiar with the August 6 presidential brief. Bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. was with the title. George Bush was given this brief August 6th of 2001 while he was on vacation. He reportedly said to the CIA operative who gave it to him, who briefed him, "Good. Now you've covered your ass. Time for me to go golfing again." Well, I added the golfing part, but that seems not terribly, probably far from reality. But he did say, "Now you've covered your ass." That presidential daily briefing, or brief, was declassified on April 10th, 2004, because the 9/11 Commission was saying, like, hey, you got to show us something. You'll remember that George Bush testified in front of the 9/11 Commission. He only went in there with his babysitter, Dick Cheney. They weren't allowed to be interviewed separately. I get nervous if I'm in alone, and what if I have to go to the bathroom? And then you'll have nobody to talk to when I got to go pee-pee. So Dick Cheney will be coming with me. Not that we have...
What George Bush said when the CIA gave him a memo while he was on vacation as usual in Crawford, saying, we're going to get attacked by Al-Qaeda in Washington and New York. He said, quote, all right, you've covered your ass now. And he went back on vacation. And then we lost all those people on 9/11. But that wasn't the all-time low. Kanye dissed them
today and is reminded about the utter failures of the Bush administration leading up to the attacks. As a new op-ed published today in the New York Times uncovers, the Bush administration was repeatedly warned in the months leading up to the attack that terrorists were operating in America and determined to carry out an attack. We all know the infamous memo Bush received titled "Bin Laden Determined to Strike in U.S." on August 6th, the month before 9/11. What we didn't know about was the slew of other memos that Bush received in the months before. Like the August 6th memo, all went largely ignored. As journalist Kurt Eichenwald uncovered in that New York Times op-ed, as early as May of 2001, the CIA was warning Bush of a coming attack. On May 1st, the CIA warned the White House there was a terrorist group presently in the United States. On June 22nd, Bush was warned that al-Qaeda attacks could be imminent. But the White House did nothing. Why? Well, as Eichenwald points out, it's because Bush and his team of neocons in the White House were functionally delusional. Rather than taking the threat seriously, they all argued that bin Laden was just bluffing to distract America from the real threat, Saddam Hussein. As Eichenwald writes, an intelligence official and a member of the Bush administration both told me in interviews that the neoconservative leaders who had recently assumed power at the Pentagon were warning the White House that the CIA had been fooled. According to this theory, bin Laden was merely pretending to be planning an attack to distract the administration from Saddam Hussein, whom the neoconservatives saw as a greater threat. That prompted the CIA to write a new memo to Bush under the title, "The U.S. is not the target of a disinformation campaign by Osama bin Laden." That same day, the administration learned that a near-term attack could have, quote, dramatic consequences, end quote. A few days later, on July 1st, Bush was told the operation was delayed, but, quote, will occur soon, end quote. On July 9th, counterterrorism officials had a meeting where they openly talked about asking for a transfer so they wouldn't be blamed for the coming attack. Again, on July 24th, Bush was warned the attacks were still being planned. Then came the August 6th memo, bin Laden determined to strike in U.S. Ignoring all these warnings and believing they were part of a disinformation campaign staged by Saddam Hussein displays not just total incompetence on the part of the Bush administration, but also downright negligence. Negligence that Americans paid dearly for and continue to pay dearly for. It's now been 11 years since the attacks. And since then, we've seen 11 years of continuing war, 11 years of continuing surveillance, and 11 years of a continuing disintegration of our civil liberties. Today, we honor the victims who lost their lives on that day, but as a nation, we must also recognize the profound impact the decisions our leaders made in the months and years after 9/11 that have made our country less safe, destabilized the planet, and shredded our Constitution.
Adversity to his own benefit by exploiting 9/11 to conduct the war he'd been preparing for all along. The first major air raid on Iraq, by the way, took place in August before 9/11.
Become basically non-existent in Republican circles. His presidency was such a train wreck that he didn't really help the McCain campaign in 2008. He was totally missing from Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign.
That Bush was a liberal, not a conservative.
He's certainly a guy who grew government a lot. He grew regulation
and
a lot.
debt a lot, and went and attacked the wrong countries.
The Trump fart sniffing is disgusting. But the point about Bush, see, this is the way a child thinks, Lou. I don't like Bush, so therefore Bush is a liberal. What? So anything that's bad is by definition left-wing or liberal. That's the way Lou Dobbs thinks because he's a child. Anything good is by definition right-wing. I've seen this thinking before. That's, Steven Crowder 101. Actually, yes, Hitler was a socialist liberal. Actually, no, Jesus was not on the left. Everything good ever is right-wing. Everything bad ever is left-wing. That's their whole shtick. You literally don't even need to watch any of their stuff because I just told you exactly what the core point is going to be in everything they've ever said ever. That's not hyperbole. So, and for those of you who watch, you already know that. So, now what's his reasoning for George W. Bush being a, quote, radical liberal? He says, he grew the debt. Okay. What? The idea that makes him liberal, I got news for you. Every Republican president from Reagan and onward, record debt and deficit. The only one to balance the budget, Bill Clinton. Democrat. So this idea, it's sheer mythology. And by the way, corporate media goes right along with it, not just Fox News, who are obviously on the extreme Republican side, but that's this myth that has just been pervasive through U.S. politics and culture for decades. That, Republicans are the party of fiscal responsibility and the Democrats are not. But then how do you explain Reagan with record debt and deficits? How do you explain Bush with record debt and deficits? Bush 2. Bush 1 increased the deficit as well. You can't explain that. And when it comes to Obama, yes, he grew the debt, but he actually reduced the deficit over his time in office. And that was with dealing with the recession and having to do stimulus spending. So this idea of obviously he's a liberal. Why? Because of debt. Are you going to take into account every other factor? Is George W. Bush on the left when it comes to abortion? Was George W. Bush on the left when it came to gay marriage? Was George W. Bush on the left when it came to any social issues? Was George W. Bush on the left when it came to economics? No, we already discussed. He did deregulation and tax cuts for the rich. So again, this thinking is it is by definition on the left or liberal if I don't like it. And then the other piece of evidence he uses to say that George Bush is liberal. He waged offensive wars against the wrong countries. Yeah, that well-known part of left-wing doctrine, waging offensive wars against countries that didn't attack us. Oh, this dude is how old is Lou Dobbs? Fucking 80 years old, and this is how he thinks about politics.
Jump on board, be my vice.
I'm honored.
Don't be honored, fucking say yes.
3,000 innocent people burned to death by those monsters, and yet you object when I refuse to kiss those monsters on the cheek and say pretty please. You answer me this: what terrorist attack would you have let go forward so you wouldn't seem like a mean and nasty fella?
Have become public, such as the terror surveillance program that we set up in right after 9/11, or the enhanced interrogation techniques we used on Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. In both those cases, we went to great lengths to make certain we'd work closely with the lawyers in the Justice Department to know where the line was. You can go this far and no further, so that we didn't violate any international commitments or obligations. So when people say torture, that may be their opinion, but with respect to the attorneys and the lawyers that are charged with reviewing what we do, It was not torture. I don't believe it was torture. There are trade propaganda value for lives.
But can't.
Right thing to do. We looked at it very carefully. I was a chief advocate of it, helped get it all set up and established. I believe deeply in what we did. I think it was the right thing to do. I was prepared, and we did. We got the authorization from the president and authorization from the Justice Department to go forward to the program. It worked. It worked now for 13 years. We've avoided another mass casualty attack against the United States. We did capture bin Laden. We did capture an awful lot of the senior guys of al-Qaeda who were responsible for that attack on 9/11. I'd do it again in a minute.
Cheney and Bush, everything that we've learned from this new torture report confirms everything that we've believed for the last 13 years. We know now that Bush knew about it, that he authorized it. Karl Rove admits that. Dick Cheney admits that they knew what was happening. Yes, they sought approval from the Justice Department, but just because you do that does not make it legal. Which brings us to another Justice Department, the Obama Justice Department. Back when they took office in 2009, one of the first things that they announced was that they were going to look forward, not backward, meaning that they were going to go ahead and give all of these criminals from the Bush administration a free pass on all this torture and the NSA spying issues. But now, with all of this evidence, for the Justice Department to once again last week tell us that they are not going to pursue any prosecutions sends a horrible message to the rest of the world.
But what if George W. Bush had taken up that offer from the Taliban and had sweetened the deal like he did with the opium, the deal to get bin Laden? What if he did something similar to what he'd done just months before and offered the Taliban cash if they promised to cut down on terrorism, clear out al-Qaeda, and change their presence in that nation? We could have given the Taliban as much as $2 billion, enough to double the nation's GDP, make everybody in the country twice as wealthy. It still would have only been a drop in the bucket compared to what we've spent on the war in Afghanistan. And if we had done that, we would have saved ourselves enough money to provide a free public college education to every single eligible student in America. As The Atlantic points out, according to Department of Education data, public colleges across America collected $62.6 billion in tuition from undergraduates in 2012. That means that the federal government would have only had to spend $62 billion to help make public college tuition free for every student in America in 2012. That's less than 11% of what we spent on the war in Afghanistan. The bottom line here is that George W. Bush had a chance to get America's priorities right, and he failed. And we're 13 years into America's longest war. Fortunately, he's not in Washington anymore, which means there's no more excuses to continue the outrageous levels of spending that we're seeing in Afghanistan today. During this daily take alone, we have spent roughly $847,500 in Afghanistan. So now, instead of spending trillions of dollars on prolonging the Bush legacy of unjust wars, we should be spending those trillions on the things that will make America great again.